I call the honourable member for Melbourne, or Kennedy.
One of the two of the previous speakers referred to the fact that a lot of us are here today because of Whitlam, and I most certainly fall into that category. I had very little interest in politics. I was asked to stand down from the local branch of the party, but when he got in, I suddenly became very, very interested and involved. And when a funny-looking old fellow with an unpronounceable name started to make him bleed, I actually decided to get very seriously involved. And I can remember vividly the state leader in Queensland, the honourable member for Petrie would remember, Ed Casey from Mackay, and there were 17 speakers in the State House. Every single speech the entire speech was spent condemning Gough Whitlam, and I was the last of those speakers. And Ed Casey got up and he said, there is just simply no gratitude in this world. And it was true that the vast bulk of the members of Parliament in that Parliament were there only because of Gough Whitlam. And I think to some degree it was a Queensland phenomenon. There's a lot been made today about what he did for education, but the world changed. I mean, every single person here said that the world changed as a result of him. I had the very great honour of publishing a best-selling history book, and I start the era of Gough Whitlam by a quote from a Midwestern businessman, probably a bit laboury sort of bloke, and he said the trouble was that we're in the 25th year of the Whitlam era. He said that in 1996 or whatever it was, 25 years after Gough had come in. So there was one thing that every person in this House agrees on, that the world was different. And the three great differences were education, free education. Now, as a Queenslander, I just didn't see where the benefit was. We could go and work in the mines during the 4-month period break from university and make enough money to pay our way through the university for the next year. Anyone could do that. So I mean, it wasn't a very wonderful thing for us. The free hospital system, which was great for the rest of Australia, it brought nothing to Queensland. We already had a free hospital system. In fact, we went backwards a little tiny bit with the Hayden initiative. And the third area was in social welfare. And I think if ever there is a great monument and legacy to Whitlam, it was just a complete and utter change in the approach to old people. I mean, there was an increase from $1,500 million a year to $5,000 million a year. It was an attitude that these people are not able to look after themselves, and we have a responsibility to look after them. And I think if ever there was a legacy that was left behind, it lay in that figure on social welfare. In Indigenous affairs, there was $29,000 million spent. The year before he came in, there was $186,000 million, $29 million spent. There was $186 million spent in the year that he left. So again, in that area, there was an attitudinal change. There are people out there that do need to be looked after, and he was determined that he would look after them. In Queensland, equal pay resulted in it, and I think it was a good decision, but it resulted in the first Australians losing their jobs. So Queensland did not have a perspective that this was a wonderful move forward for the first Australians. In fact, probably a counter-attitude prevailed. But if you were saying, you know, was he a good man or not, when I was writing the history book, I was quite amazed to find out that Gough Whitlam had not only put Rex Connors into the ministry, but was a very, very fervent backer of Rex Connors. Rex Connors wanted to develop Australia. He was very much in the Queensland mould of development. You know, it's a government's job to develop and create jobs. And he wanted to raise the money so we could do it ourselves. And the Murdoch press that had backed Gough Whitlam very, very strongly, they were involved in the North West Shelf gas and oil developments. And it was held up by Rex Connors because Rex did not want to see a foreigner develop those resources. He wanted Australian money to come in and develop the resources. And the irony of it all was that if the Treasurer, Mr Cairns, had been spending more time on Treasury than on other affairs, there were the two instruments there that were put there by McEwen, the AIDC, and they were put there for exactly that purpose, to buy back the farm and to develop the farm. The Commonwealth Development Bank and the AIDC. The two mechanisms were there. And the great tragedy and irony, for those that weren't great supporters of Whitlam, I suppose, was a good thing to happen. But the great tragedy and irony was that Rex Connors was left trying to get money from overseas in a most improper manner, and the Whitlam government again, or Gough Whitlam, was characterised by very great honesty. And having seen many, many governments where very corporate influences play a very large part in the government of Australia and the government of the states, it was a government that was very clean of that sort of influence. But of course, Whitlam suffered as a result of that, insofar as very powerful media barons turned upon him with very great aggression. But the sympathy of Australian people, to some degree, would have been far greatly behind him, and particularly in states like Queensland, if Rex Connors had been backed up. But of course, he wasn't. The Treasurer had his mind on other things, and the tragedy that occurred, if it was the tragedy that Connors and the great vision that he had, that Gough Whitlam shared, never came to fruition, and the resources of Australia were developed by foreign corporations. But it's got to be said that for people like myself, a 25% across the board cut in tariffs was the introduction of a new era in Australian history, and it was not an era that a person like me would regard as a great era for that introduction in Australian history. So it is, as everyone has said today, the start of a new period in Australian history. There is no doubt that anyone in Australia would contend or question that. Whether the things that happened were good for Australia, well, again, history can judge in the longer term what were the reasons. But all I can say is I came out of a state where the things I think that were very important to a person living in Sydney had absolutely no resonance in a state with massive development taking place, with dams being built everywhere, with the coal industry and the aluminium industry being opened up by government money and government activity. It just never resonated. And when he came in, the wool industry, the great industry that had carried Australia for as long as it did, had collapsed, and then the beef industry collapsed. And there was no sympathy coming out of Sydney for those industries. There was a very great, vigorous and angry reaction that there was no sympathy coming. So a combination of those factors, but I think one of the very little known factors was his great support for Rex Connors and a place in history that Rex deserved, but because he failed, he was punished. And the history books read badly, whereas actually the history books in the longer term will read very, very positively in an area that Gough Whitlam was never given any credit for and where he probably deserved most credit.